Historically, women and girls in Zambia and Uganda have faced various forms of discrimination, including unequal access to education, employment, and decision-making positions, leading to economic disparities. Unpaid care work, on the other hand, which is largely undertaken by women and girls, is often undervalued and goes unrecognized in economic systems, limiting women's ability to fully participate in the formal economy. Beyond this, traditional fiscal policies and budgeting processes have often been gender blind, failing to consider the different needs and priorities of women and girls. Over time, this has perpetuated inequalities and excluded women's voices from decision-making processes. Considering this background, the concept of fiscal justice for women and girls as part of efforts to achieve gender equality, human rights, and social justice cannot be overstated. As part of greater efforts to contribute to more transparent and accountable revenue generation and spending policies by transforming fiscal policies to better respond to the needs of citizens, especially women and girls in Uganda and Zambia, FemNet continues to pursue research and advocacy initiatives under the Fiscal Justice for Women and Girls, FJWG project. FJWG is a collaborative initiative founded in 2020 between Oxfam Uganda, Oxfam Zambia, the Southern and Eastern Africa Trade Information and Negotiations Institute, CIATINI, in both Uganda, the Consumer Unity and Trust Society, CUTS, Zambia, FemNet, as well as a number of CSOs both in Uganda and Zambia. The specific objective of the project is to strengthen the ability of civil society organizations, women's rights organizations, and citizens in Uganda to hold decision makers to account on formulation and implementation of fiscal policies, affecting women and girls on a national and regional level. Further, this project empowers civil society with the tools necessary to instigate meaningful policies, change for citizens, as well as engage through influencing and campaigning initiatives, so as to create more informed and empowered citizenry that can effectively hold us duty bearers to account, demand for improved public service. A project such as this definitely highlights the importance of this AfCoDD theme of reimagining, rethinking, reorganizing, and remobilizing for Africa world order. Now, I'd like to introduce our panelists. Firstly, we George Manda, who is a governance officer at Oxfam in Zambia, who is dedicated to advancing the cause of fiscal justice for women and girls. Next, we have Janet Namute, a Zambian lawyer currently in employment with Consumer Unite and Trust Society, CUTS Zambia, as a programs assistant under the Fiscal Justice for Women and Girls. Next up, we have Joseph Owenyi, a programs manager, governance and accountability at Oxfam Novib, Uganda. We have Regina Navunga, a program coordinator, financing for development program at Southern and Eastern Africa Trade Information and Negotiation Institute, CIATINI, Uganda. Next, we have Sophie Njuba, the finance for development coordinator at Oxfam, Uganda. And last but not least, we have Tendai Miti, a passionate and dedicated gender equality and women's rights advocate at the Sister Foundation, Zambia. I'd like to first start by thanking the panelists for being here today. We'll just dive right into the questions. I'll start with Tendai, even though I called you up last. Seeing you are a women's rights and gender equality advocate, what ways is fiscal justice an imperative for gender equality?
Okay, thank you so much for the question and the introduction, Wambere. Thank you so much to everyone who's in the room right now. Okay, and when we're speaking about fiscal justice and why it's an imperative for gender equality and why it's important for women and girls, Fiscal justice is crucial for gender equality in every context, in every continent, because firstly, it addresses economic disparities that disproportionately affect women by implementing things like fair taxation, gender sensitive budgeting, allocation and targeted social spending, and fiscal policies can reduce gender based inequalities in different contexts, but more especially in the context of Zambia and Uganda. Furthermore, it's important to note that in Africa, over 70% of women are excluded financially. And when you look at it closely, you find that women are responsible for over 60% of the work that is done, and yet earn just about 10%. And even worse, they have about a percentage, 1% in property that is in their name. And so another thing that's important to note is that there is over 40 billion financing gap between men and women in Africa. And when this happens and we begin to ignore how fiscal policies are affecting them, and we begin to speak on fiscal policies and fiscal justice without them in the room, we begin to leave them and continue to leave them further behind. Another thing to note is that with the poverty levels in Africa, but more especially, I'll speak on the Zambian context, when we ignore how we need to center women and girls, when we're speaking on fiscal policies, when we're speaking on fair taxation, you will find that if we do not give it a deliberate approach, and if we do not give deliberate actions to things like gender sensitive budgeting, you'll find that our governments will keep spending on things that they do not, that they deem profitable. So they'll ignore things like healthcare, they'll ignore things like education, and then in turn we'll have very horrible healthcare, and then we'll have women even spending more of their time in unpaid care work. And we've seen some reports going on in the last few years on unpaid care work. You see women leave their jobs to stay home and take care of their sick children, take care of their sick partners, and this would just still draw them backwards in terms of earning and in terms of also contributing to their countries. Another thing is that attaining gender. Okay, do you want me to go a bit slower? Thank you. Okay, I was saying attaining gender equality and closing gender gaps is urgent across the continent, but more especially in my country, Zambia. Advancing gender equality around Africa could add 10% to GDP, or $316 billion by 2025. And this is from a McKinsey Power of Parity report. This was done in 2019 or 2020. It is important to note, even as we are sitting here, that as we continue to gather at forums like these, we need to continuously push and make sure that women, girls, and other minorities are not sidelined when we speak about fiscal policies and fiscal justice. We cannot continue speaking about Africa's debt crisis. We cannot continue speaking about Africa's development and its impacts without making women the face of the crisis that we're currently facing. Adequate funding for education, healthcare, and social services benefit women and girls and enable the access to opportunities. Addressing the huge gender pay gaps will contribute to a more balanced and equitable society. In essence, fiscal justice will help create an environment where women have equal opportunities and can fully participate and thrive. And even as we continue to address illicit financial flows as one of the means to fiscal justice, we need to ensure that even as we language everything that we're speaking about, we're very deliberate in including women, girls, and minorities. For the longest time, the patriarchy has used technicalities as a way to close doors, as a way to gatekeep and to keep women, girls, and other minorities out of the room. And we cannot continue to sit and use technicalities, they do not understand as a way to keep women out of the room, as a way to keep people we deem less educated out of the room. And I'll give an example. If you go out there and you go to women on the street, or you ask people who are trading in markets that you normally not find on forums like this, you ask them what they're facing, you ask them how they're using their money, you ask them about the government, they'll be able to explain in simple terms how the money that they were using last year cannot buy them what they have this year. But then you have our governments continuously sit in rooms and make decisions and pronounce these fiscal policies without the people that they're affecting the most in the room. And so it just goes to say that at the end of it, we need to realize that if we continue looking at fiscal justice as just a numbers game, and we continue thinking success for us is something that we can equate in GDP and in growth, and not necessarily as something that is helping the human beings in the country, we're going to fail. Another thing is that on one end, you will notice in countries like Zambia, where you have fiscal policies which seem very progressive, and you have tax reliefs, and you have a lot of pronouncements made which look very economical and look like they will attain economic justice. When you look closely inside and you see who those things are benefiting, you'll find that the women are being left behind. In Zambia, we have over 50% of the agriculture being done by women. And last year, the president gave very good incentives in the agriculture sector. But a closer look at this will tell you that those incentives were targeted at high-end farmers, which further leaves the over 60% of women farmers behind. And therein lies the problem. It's that people discussing fiscal policies, people are talking budgeting, people are making decisions whilst leaving women, girls, and minorities behind. So I'll end here for now on there.
Hello, okay, sorry. Thank you so much for that. I feel like you've raised very important aspects, the fact that women are sidelined, the fact that women are being left behind. You've given staggering numbers of the fact that fair taxation is over 70% of the women, and yet women excluded from 60% of the work. That is not how it should be, definitely. And thank you very much for that. Next, I would like to ask Namute, as an implementing organization, what are the challenges your organization has encountered in advocating for achieving fiscal justice in your country, and similar to Tendai, the Zambia context of that?
All right. Thank you very much, Wambere, for that specific question, which is very important. And I guess this is why we are in this particular room. So I will speak to some of the challenges that, to be specific, Zambia has been facing in regards to implementing, especially the Fiscal Justice for Women and Girls project. But before I could even dive in some of the challenges that we do face as an organization, as Zambia as well in general, we need to highlight some of the actors that are at play when it comes to fiscal justice for women and girls. So, for example, I'm sure this will even cut across to Uganda as well, and probably other African countries. So we have the government itself, where we have the line ministries, we have civil society organizations, we have women's rights groups, we have the citizenry itself, and most of all, we also have the female activists. Then going back to some of the challenges, first of all, I think this is one thing we can't run away from, which was the COVID pandemic. That was one of the major setbacks, especially in implementing this particular project in Zambia, because as at that particular time, it was difficult to implement anything physical. And I guess it was an eye-opener for most of us Africans, and also I'm sure other countries as well, in digitalizing a lot of project activities, a lot of agendas were now digitalized. But that was one of our major setbacks, because we did not know how to really navigate around COVID-19 at the time. The other challenge that we have faced especially to the context of Zambia, is that we have a few women's rights group organizations. And if we do with the little that we have, and I'm glad that Sister is actually here, which is one of the organizations that we've been working with closely in implementing this particular project. So where we have female rights group organizations, a few of them narrow it down to fiscal justice for women and girls, as most of them just generalize other issues that move around women and girls and feminism. But we have a few organizations that actually focus more on fiscal justice for women and girls. Hence, that has been one of the biggest challenges. However, another challenge that we have as well is empowering civil society organizations and women's rights organization in pushing over this particular agenda for fiscal justice for women and girls, as most of the emerging CSOs or the emerging women's rights organizations lack financial capacity. And for us to be able to implement this particular agenda, there is need for financial capacity. And I guess this is why we're also in this particular room, so that we are able to find solution as to how best we can assist or how best we can drive this particular agenda, even to assist the emerging CSOs in implementing this particular project. And even speaking apart from the civil society aspect of it, we also have certain challenges that we face in Zambia. For example, we do not currently have the Ministry of Gender, which has been a huge issue, especially for an organization such as CATS International, specifically implementing this particular project. It becomes very difficult to navigate around which particular ministry we should have our focus on, because apart from not having a Ministry of Gender, it's been shrunk to a gender division, which has been a very huge difference in terms of issues we could address to a ministry, if at all it was there. And I'm aware that Uganda does have the Ministry of Gender, but unfortunately Zambia does not have that gender anymore. So those are some of the challenges that we're facing. And apart from the fact that we do not have recognized unpaid care work. So we had that in 2017, but currently we do not have this particular aspect or this particular division in Zambia, which has also been a very huge issue in implementing this particular project, because it seeks to reinstate that idea or reinstate that particular policy of paid care work. So those are some of the issues and challenges that we are currently facing as an implementing organization, and also Zambia in general. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Namute, for that. I find it very interesting that your challenges also counter basically what Tendai was speaking about the government's role, and also what we've been talking about in general about getting information to the forefront and how we can expand on this. And so I'd also like to get a perspective from you, Regina, on Uganda's challenges. And I'll just repeat the question, which is, as an implementing organization, what are the challenges your organization has encountered in advocating for achieving fiscal justice for women and girls?
Okay, thank you, Wambere. Allow me to stand. I think for me, one of the challenges, you saw how we were mobilizing you to come in. Yes? Yes? Because she has told me I give a perspective of the implementers. Oxfam will talk about their side. As implementers, that is what we go through. What has just happened right now, right? We have to convince citizens that it's good to pay taxes. They are aware. A few years back, some of them didn't know, because the composition of our tax system, some are indirect and others are direct. It's the same thing in Africa. But we have those who are believers, right? That it's good to pay taxes. We have those who are on the edge. It is good, but I will not pay. And then there are those who are middle ground, right? I'll pay, I'll not pay. So it is that we have to deal with as CSOs. We have to employ different strategies as we do our work. However, even as we do that, when it comes back to planning, internally, even before we blame the external, maybe government, internally as CSOs, still I'll come back to this context. Gender issues, it's around 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock, people are tired, so we don't prioritize them. That is one of the challenges as the implementers. It's always a cross-cutting issue, right? Gender, among so many things, boys, men, yeah, etc. So it comes back to us as planners. How do we plan to address some of these issues? The issues are technical in nature. Fiscal justice, what does that mean to a layperson, right? Is it the revenue, expenditure, the allocation? If I can't ably talk about it as Regina, at the end of the day, how am I going to convince you? How am I going to convince the politicians, the technocrats? So it has to start with us, but you find that even internally, we have capacity gaps as CSOs before we reach out to other stakeholders. The fact that the tax system is both indirect and direct, you find that some citizens up to now don't know that they're paying taxes. And this, some of them have got to know because of the increased work that the CSOs do over time. A few years back, I think we had graduated tax in Uganda. It's everyone doesn't want to hear that. Graduated tax, it was paid mainly by the able-bodied people. Alan, if you're above 18, you had to pay graduated tax. And you found that most people had to run away, right, from paying taxes. So that was removed around 1996. And that has got people to lay back, thinking that they're not paying any indirect taxes, yet they pay. I think the other challenge that we also face is the technocrats. I think she has alluded to it, that some of the policies are gender blind. It goes back, some of them don't appreciate, some of them don't understand forces from above, among other things. Then the other challenge is working with the parliamentarians. After 5 years, you build rapport. 5 years, they go. Another team comes in. So for us, it's continuously working with them, building their capacity, strengthening them. And it's a part of life. Once a new team comes on board, we work with them. If they go, some of them can even continue to champion some of our work. The other challenge that we have is working in silos, right? Those who do the budget work alone, the youth work alone, debt alone, tax alone, that's women issues alone. Yet we believe that the foundation of some of these issues, even before you allocate, is the revenue. So increasingly, you see in Uganda that the CSOs are working together to address some of these issues because they all have different energies. Once we enhance our capacity, it can feed into the different strategies. The other issue that I would like to speak to are the structured engagements. Sometimes they exist, other times they don't exist, especially when we are influencing, like with Ministry of Finance, Parliament. Sometimes you have to fight for that space. Formally, informally, you have to be there. However, where we are not, we have to work through a number of strategies to ensure that our positions get to the table. There are a number of challenges, but for us in Uganda, we've been lucky that we have built rapport over time with the ministries, government officials, Parliament, that even when you're not there, they'll call upon you and say, okay, Tax Justice Alliance members, where are you? Because we work in a coalition and we have to present our issues. We have to be ready. There's an opportunity that we have the domestic revenue mobilization strategy. Government knows the challenges. They've committed to work with CSOs. How do we ride on that as CSOs to champion our work? I'll stop there. There's so many challenges, but they are the same challenges. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Regina, for giving us the Ugandan perspective and also highlighting similar to Tendai as well, the fact that sometimes gender isn't deemed as a priority, or it's sidelined because it's maybe not as profitable, and so it's not handled with the importance that it needs to. Given the time and it being evening, we'll move away from the negative challenges and try and look at how these challenges have been taken to form toolkits and put in place research innovation. And with that, I'd like Joseph to please expand on the Uganda Fair Tax Monitor. And then after that, you can join in as well, George, and give the Zambia perspective as well.
Yes, thank you so much. Building on what Regina said, a few years ago, I think it was in 2014, civil society organizations came together and were able to craft a methodology that we called Fair Tax Monitor. This particular methodology, we wanted to utilize it to generate, a few years ago in 2014, civil society organizations came together. That was Oxfam, Novib, together TGNA and other partners like Siatini, etc., that were able to craft a methodology that would help us, generate advocacy evidence that would champion our engagement with citizens and different stakeholders in promoting fiscal justice. So the tool that we were able to develop, which we call the Fair Tax Monitor, was started in 2014, and it majorly enabled us come up with what we call a common research framework that is based on 6 research areas. The 6 research areas that we actually looked into was one, we're able to develop an area to assess how burdensome is the tax system, how progressive is it, especially in terms of redistributing income from the rich to the poor. The other area that the tool was assessing was revenue sufficiency. How is the tax system mobilizing revenues, and how much is it mobilizing? And also looking at leakages. How much are we leaking as a country? The other area of research was on tax competition and corporate incentives, because we know that in Africa we do promote foreign direct investments, so we offer a lot of incentives. So the tool was also designed to, help us assess what level are we of incentives are we giving out, and also the tool was able to assess the effectiveness of a tax system. How effective is the tax system? Because we all have national revenue authorities, so it was imperative to understand how effective is the tax administration system, and then also it was able to assess the component on spending, because you can't talk about taxation, the revenue mobilization, without the aspect of spending. So giving us a picture of how is the government spending the revenue that they are mobilizing. You'll find that in most African countries, even before COVID-19, a huge chunk of spending was going towards servicing debt, security and other things, as opposed to investment in healthcare and education. Then the other aspect is on transparency and accountability. So in a nutshell, Uganda has been able to do 3 Fair Tax Monitor assessments. The first was in 2014, the other was in 2019, and then we did another one in 2022. And I'm not going to enter into the details of the findings, but I'm going to share with you a summary of what we found out, especially in terms of understanding how Uganda's fiscal system is contributing to girls and women enjoying their rights. But before I go to that, our assessment found that the government of Uganda had actually made strides, commendable progress in promoting gender responsive budgeting, because Uganda is one of the countries that is actually, has a gender responsive budgeting system in place, and they offer certification at the different levels of the budget cycle. We have a gender an equity compliance certificate, which is actually offered. And then we also have an Equal Opportunities Commission, which actually tracks the progress and holds the different ministries and agencies of the government accountable. But when it comes to the aspect on the tax system, because we know most macroeconomic policies gender blind, we found that Uganda had actually made minimal progress in making the tax system fair and gender responsive. Specifically, the country still depends majorly on indirect taxes like VAT, like excise duty, and customs, which we know in one or another disproportionately affect low-income earners and women in the other end. So we realized that that was actually a critical finding, because you find that when it comes to accessing household items like energy, like electricity, like water, etc., you find that women actually are impacted generally, especially if you raise a tax on VAT or excise duty in terms of accessing such a service. So we also noted that the Uganda Revenue Authority up to today does not collect and update sex disaggregated data, which is actually surprising, because without that data, you are unable to assess and determine how a particular tax policy is impacting on either women or girls or boys or men, which makes it hard actually to support policy reform, especially at national level. We also noted that Uganda still gives out large chunks of harmful tax incentives to be able to attract FDIs, and there's no information available on the benefit of these particular tax incentives, and the government actually is not even aware of the likely negative impacts. They don't even do a cost-benefit analysis. So this generally also affects on the amount of revenues that are available. It leaves the government with a gap, so that as they are in a dire need of revenues, they continue putting in place new taxes on VAT and excise duty, which continue entrenching the gender inequality. We also noted that on the aspect of spending, there is still unclarity on how, despite the fact that there are certificates of gender compliance that are issued, the spending is still cannot be directly linked to having a positive impact on delivering services for women and girls, because you find that even though you provide a service to a particular social sector, a huge chunk of the money is going towards administration costs. If you go to the local government, they take a huge chunk of that, and even the services themselves are not directly linked to reducing inequalities on gender. And because of that, we still see that there is need for the government to design a fiscal system which is gender sensitive. They need to put in place a system that generates the data that supports them to do impact analysis on whatever policy decision they are taking or designing and ready to put in place on fiscal policy. And we also note that the government needs also, consider the priorities of the citizens, especially the women and the girls, during the designing of these tax and spending policies of the budget. Yeah, for now, I can stop there. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Joseph, for highlighting a key aspect, which is that we actually need to look at the roots, like what is the government using these funds for, etc. Now I'd like to ask George to kindly expand on the Zambia Fair Tax Monitor, and specifically, could you elaborate more on the findings of the Zambia?
All right, thank you so much, Wamberi, for that. Before I dive into giving a conversation about the findings of the Fair Tax Monitor, allow me to bring the conversation a bit back. Yes, so when we talk about fiscal justice, what really are we talking about? That's the question that we are all trying to answer in this place. So when we talk about fiscal justice, we're trying to look at how economic resources and tax burdens are being distributed fairly in a society. Put in a layman's language, we're looking at how government revenue expenditure is translating meaningfully into the lives of the citizens. And these citizens, who are they? Yes. So when I'm talking about the citizens who are actually benefiting from this fiscal justice, we're not talking about those citizens who are living in motorized gates or who can actually pay for their private healthcare services. No. We're talking about the citizens who look forward to the constituency development fund just so they can have clean water. The citizens who look forward to the government to provide healthcare services just so they can have medication in their hospitals. The marginalized groups in society. And the marginalized groups in society are the women and girls. Now, coming back to the conversation over the Fair Tax Monitor, like Joseph put it, it was started in 2014 in Uganda, but then in Zambia, it only came about in 2020 because we saw a need for us to identify some of the bottlenecks in the tax systems that are found in the Zambian government. So after the report that was done in 2020, we came up with a few findings. And one of them was that 56.7% of low-income earners in Zambia is actually comprised of women. And just during the COVID-19 and post-COVID-19, we found that only 19% of women could actually afford to find food in a week's work. And that was actually drastically and pushing us further to advocate for the conversation and start the project, which we deemed Fiscal Justice for Women and Girls. It was already running in Uganda, but then it had to be pushed to Zambia. Further, our findings found that further with help from Tax Justice Network Africa, we found that 46.2% of tax revenue in Zambia came from indirect taxes. And we all know that indirect taxes are simply value-added taxes on some commodities. These commodities being food items, soap, menstrual hygienic products, which women are the sole consumers of these products. Already we are seeing that these people are adversely affected by the income that they earn, and then there's zero tax exemption on this value-added tax, and which is one of the major contributors to the tax revenue base in Zambia. Then further, according to the United Nations Development Program, we discovered that the Gender Inequality Index report that was done in 2019 showed that in Zambia, the Gender Inequality Index stood at 53.7%. So a lot of, you can get me? All right. So a lot of activities, yes. So a lot of activities that are actually done in Zambia benefit the male citizenry, thereby putting the female at a disadvantage. When we talk about how women are adversely affected, we always try to find a conversation on how we can help curb some of these problems. And according to our report, we figured out that if only we can push the government to have gender-responsive budget policies, it can actually be meaningful, because we look at the budget as the most influential macroeconomic tool that can help us influence policy. See, in 2020, going into 2021, we had a group of women rights organizations as well as other civil society organizations who advocated to have the tax brackets raised for the low income earners, which are the women. So in Zambia, from 0 kwacha to 4,000 kwacha, from 0 kwacha to 4,000 kwacha, you wouldn't be taxed. But then after a WASIS was put in to say that in as much as this was happening, there was little disposable income that women were actually taking home. This tax bracket was increased from 4,000 to 4,800. So as it stands in Zambia, from 0 kwacha to 4,800, you are not taxed, thereby at least leaving a huge chunk of disposable income for women to go with home. Then another major finding that we found was the inefficiency in the tax collection. So when you look at the taxpayers in Zambia, it's mainly comprised of the formal sector. While the informal sector, in as much as it's big, we really do not capture it. It's really sad that the Zambia Revenue Authority hasn't put in measures yet to help capture some of the people in the informal sector who are actually making more money, and we could help increase the tax base, thereby translating into this very same fiscal justice conversation that we're having. I think I'll just leave it here.
George, a round of applause for him. Yeah, I think it's very important to understand the problem before trying to solve it. So the fact that the findings are giving us a better understanding and clarity of what exactly it is that we need to be tackling. So I'll just give the last question to Sophie. I know we're running out of time, but please bear with us. The last session ran longer than it should have. So, Sophie, what are the pathways for expanding advocacy for fiscal justice for women and girls regionally and continentally?
Thank you, Amber. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. From what we've heard from the previous speakers, I'll start off by saying, one, knowledge is power. And if we're going to advocate, we have to be informed. We have to have the information that we need to move forward. The discussants before me painted the picture of what we have. So starting with research and understanding how deep this issue is, how bad the challenge is, and then seeing how we find solutions. That would be the first pathway I could point out. And this goes to, we have understanding fiscal justice, the frameworks and in which it works, but also gender justice. How deep does it go? And then seeing how to link the two, bringing that linkage between fiscal justice and gender justice. One of the previous speakers talked about, we don't have data. So how will we know how bad the problem is if we don't know how it's affecting the most marginalized? How the different tax decisions that are made affect the marginalized groups. So being informed is one, but also having the data that we need to be able to guide the decisions that we make, that governments make, that different actors make is another. And as part of that, bringing in an element of some of the reforms being, for example, gender responsive budgeting, having it as a key element in what we do or what governments do, which goes from understanding it to be able to implement it. How much are we putting into the social sectors, for example, and being able to follow it through in health, in education? How are we using the resources that we have to deal with these issues? Because later on they have an implication towards our fiscal justice, but also in terms of bringing out gender justice. That is key. So mainstreaming gender in different aspects of development, including fiscal justice. We are here for an African conference. That means each of us comes from a different country, but these countries have a contribution to what we do towards the continent. We have regional blocks that we are not taking as much advantage of. Why do I say that? In terms of fiscal justice, in terms of gender justice, there are challenges that are country specific, but also there are some that cut across countries that we can leverage on through our blocks, seeing how to address some of these challenges, because some cut across countries or some are caused by other countries. So seeing how to sit on the table and be able to address some of these challenges together, the EAC, the SADC, COMESA, ECOWAS, IGAD, they all have a voice that can be put towards fighting some of these challenges. So us seeing how we use these blocks to our advantage in terms of improving fiscal justice and also with the element of gender justice. Moving from the regional to the international, there have been so many discussions before around IMF, around World Bank. The UN has a number of conventions that are spaces that we can use to put forward ways of improving the challenges that we face, that we see coming through in terms of gender justice and fiscal justice, to achieve fiscal justice. But then another that starts from our countries, also starts from home,
that are our countries and moving up to the regions and later on to the continent are the voices of women in decision-making places. We've come a long way we've not yet achieved it around women in leadership, but we have come a long way. And I think that is serious potential that we have, that we can use. Our members of parliament, in Uganda, we have over 300 members of parliament currently that can play a critical role in fighting or in addressing some of these challenges from the positions that they hold. We have speakers in each country. In Uganda, luckily, currently we have a female speaker, but using that power to put forward some of the issues that we'd want to see improved or changed within fiscal justice, to achieve fiscal justice. As CSOs, we have coalitions and networks, and they start from country, but they move to the regions. Right now, there's a tax justice network of Africa, AfCoDD. These networks, we can use the feminist networks, Femnet. We can use them as spaces for advocacy, to put forward, painting the picture of how bad it is and seeing how we can get solutions towards these challenges that we see. And as we do that, some of the elements that we need to emphasize is how much is our government spending on social sectors, on addressing the challenges that the marginalized face. These are some of the things that we can put forward using the different spaces that we have at the country, regional, continental, and international level. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Sophie, especially for highlighting the point of getting members of parliament and speakers of different counties to actually understand, getting them involved in spaces such as this, so that when they're advocating for certain agendas, they're getting a better perspective of what we need and what we want and the changes we want to see. At this point, I would like to open the floor. Questions from the floor. Anyone who has anything, kindly raise your hand, and you can direct your question. You can make it general. I do know we have a question online, but I wanted to give the audience a chance first before I take the online question. Or shall I just? Yeah. Okay, so without the Ministry of Gender in Zambia, how are you able to push for the gender policy in Zambia? Citizens have also not understood the concept of gender yet, which we feel is still a challenge in Uganda. So those are two. There's one dedicated to Zambia and one dedicated to, Uganda. Sophie, would you like? So you pick.
I can come through for Uganda. What has been done to help citizens understand gender better, and Regina pointed to it, part of it at the start during her discussion. There's a lot of capacity building that's many civil society organizations are undertaking. Not just, most of the emphasis she put on was on our leaders, but even for the citizenry to understand what gender is, why it's important for them to know it, and also the role that they play in making it better or making it worse. That gap, if it's a marginalized, maybe women versus men, boys and girls, how do citizens contribute to widening that gap, but also what they can do to make it better? If a father is prioritizing education of a boy over a girl, and the girl is staying at home, we have leaders in the communities, even people within the communities, who explain to them why it's necessary for both of these, because they both need these opportunities. Later on, this girl who is staying at home will become a burden to the brother who is older and has gone further in development or growth than the sister who was left behind. So bring the need to and understand that. And there are a number of methodologies for Oxfam. There's a girls methodology that is being used to help families, communities, society appreciate the need for understanding gender and being able to mainstream practice, use it within the societies for development. Thank you.
All right. Maybe you could put more clarity. Was it the challenges that we have for not having a ministry?
So the question, sorry. Okay. The question reads, without the Ministry of Gender in Zambia, how are you able to push for the gender policy in Zambia?
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Thank
Okay. Great. Thank you for that particular question. So it's not been easy for a start. I will bring it down to coming from the legal perspective as well. So we have our gender laws, and to be specific, we have our Gender Act that we have in Zambia. And there are certain duties that a minister is supposed to carry out, and if there is no provision for that particular person, that particular task cannot move forward. And as not having a ministry, which means not having a minister, makes it difficult for certain elements that are enshrined in this particular act to be able to follow through. And not only that, we will also not take away from the fact that it's still sitting under the office of the president. So now there it goes back to having a bigger challenge in pushing the gender policy, because now it becomes an issue of priority. And I think that's one thing that has come out, or that is constantly coming out, on the issues of gender and how they are prioritized. But now we are having a whole ministry that has been shrunk into a division and now sitting at the office of the president. So already we can see a very huge bureaucracy that will go on in terms of us being able to even implement the gender policy. So I think that those are some of the issues that are refraining or making it a bit difficult to push the gender policy forward. But in curbing those challenges, this is why we push more advocacy on women's rights organizations, on civil society, to champion it head on independently in pushing the gender policy. Unless if Tendai from Sister has any additions to how we're addressing it.
It's not very different, except something else that we have been doing now is you address whatever challenges you have to the ministry that's in charge of it. So if we have any issues around education, we then just directly go to the Ministry of Education. Even though we're a feminist organization, and even though others are women's rights organizations, and they would get better help if they went to the Ministry of Gender. So we now just work with the line ministries and the committees that are at the National Assembly that address different thematic areas in which we want to push. Yeah.
Thank you so much for giving us your answers and your feedback. Once again, I'd like to ask if the audience has any questions. Okay, we have 2 questions. Yeah, go ahead. Please introduce yourself and then ask your question.
Thank you. My name is Jennifer van den Heever, Member of Parliament from Namibia. I'm having a very small question to the women. Being an advocate on gender issues, is there any possibility to have platforms for awareness amongst the regions, not only in Uganda, not only in Zambia, but across the continent, whether there will be platforms for benchmarking and awareness campaigns specifically on fiscal justice? Because some of us are not familiar with the term, we are doing it otherwise. So it will be very good if maybe Sister or any other organization can reach out to the other countries for benchmarking.
You want to hear the second question or first take that one? Could we?
Okay, thank you. My name is Vanessa Jaravaza from AfCoDD. I was particularly interested in certain sections that Regina and the gentleman, I think George, had mentioned to with regard to the informal sector. I'm not sure if it's the same in Zambia and Uganda as where I'm from in Zimbabwe, where women account for the majority of the population in the informal sector. And as he had mentioned, that a huge chunk of tax comes from the same informal sector. Now, what I have a question with is that as CSOs, we have advocated for a lot of taxes and fair taxation and gender budgeting. But what I'm not getting is currently, governments concentrate more on looking at the size of the informal sector and not the capacity of the informal sector to do with taxation. My question is, what have we as civil society organizations done to redirect their focus? Because the informal sector, again, I'm not so sure about Uganda and Zambia, but for example, in Zimbabwe, the informal sector comprises mostly of people that are trying to survive and not necessarily great entrepreneurs that are making it and thriving in their businesses, because then otherwise they would have been formalized. The reason that they are in the informal sector is they can't even afford to meet the basic criteria of running a business, doing it so well and earning enough to then pay taxes. So before we can go to advocating for awareness of paying taxes and the importance of taxes, how much have we done in advocating for supporting women in whatever sector they are, especially in the informal sector? How much of gender budgeting, even if it was there, how much of that money would go to supporting the small businesses so that they thrive enough to make enough to afford to become formal? If we don't talk about that, then I guess we're also missing the point. If we talk about gender budgeting in terms of health and education, particularly in health, most of the issues to do with health is that women are lacking a proper living environment and proper nutrition. So even if we fund hospitals, they'll still keep coming back to the hospitals because they are sick of the living environments. They're sick of the poor nutrition. How much are we doing to empower women, especially in the rural areas? How much are we doing to empower women to make enough so that they are able to afford their own and level up their own standards of living and afford proper nutrition before we even get to hospitals that will then take care of their illnesses? Let's concentrate and focus on the sources with which they would actually not end up needing hospitals. That is good nutrition, and that is more money, that is better disposable income, and that is thriving businesses and sources of income. So my other question was, in advocating for gender policies, do we have rates with which we can actually compare? Because from your presentations to the both of you, both in Uganda and Lusaka, Uganda and Zambia, it seems as though the portion that governments require from the informal sector is much higher than the portion with which they give to the informal sector to support it, which already sidelines a lot of women and leaves them in a more detrimental position. So before we talk about other issues, what is our focus to empower these women?
Thank you. Thank you so much for those questions. Very engaging and very thorough. I appreciate that. So for the first question, looking at the fiscal justice and understanding it better, and not just from the Zambia-Uganda perspective, it was directed to all three all four ladies really. So I don't know who would like to take the question. Maybe Regina, or yeah.
I will just answer broadly, then my colleagues
Yeah.
can add. The informal sector. For us in Uganda, we categorize it. Not everyone that is in the informal sector is informal, ideally. We've got to learn that there is formal within the informal. So we've proposed different strategies to government. Some of the solutions that government had come up with was the issue around mobile money. They are claiming that they're reaching more people into the informal sector to pay taxes. And that we thought that wasn't addressing the core issue. But broadly, it's to empower the women groups. We work with a number of associations to empower them that they're taxpayers and they should be demanding for accountability. Some of them have raised issues around toilet fee, right? That if you compare the men to the women, the men and the women, the times they visit the toilet, the women are impacted more. It's a fee for them, they say it's a tax. So how do we work with them as well as the leadership in the different markets to ensure that there is progressivity in the way taxes are accounted for, services are delivered? And we've also come up with positions where we are saying that the presumptive tax affects the women more. If I think the way it's categorized, a lady, maybe a saloon owner, a saloon owner might pay more taxes compared to a business that is owned by a gentleman. Yes. So there's been a review of the presumptive tax, but nevertheless, the issues are still there in the informal sector. They are still broad, but we are working closely with URA. We engage them in the different spaces. We take them to speak to the women, not only to comply, but to ensure that even the law favors the women at the end of the day. And for us, the best solution is to give them the knowledge, ensure that they participate actively in challenging the government, the local governments where the services are delivered at the end of the day, as well as the national level. We sometimes do cross learnings among the different markets so that they can share notes, share the good stories, the challenges, and the opportunities. You want to add anything?
Yeah. What I wanted to say is that besides influencing an enabling environment, especially on the aspects of taxes that are favorable to these businesses, because there is a specific regime called the presumptive tax within the income tax. So when you come to an informal business, you just look at someone's stock and you're like, okay, you pay this amount of money. It has for a long time been regressive, and we've been actually advocating for the Revenue Authority of Uganda to reform the tax system and come up with a favorable policy, especially for those businesses to be able to thrive, because most of them are actually owned by women. Because when you just come and levy an expensive presumptive tax, it's going to kick them out of business. They'll end up even selling their capital to be able to pay the tax. So that's one of the things. But currently, the government has developed a new market act, and we are in discussions to influence the regulations. And we're actually going to be holding consultations with many of those business owners who are in the informal sector, including market vendors, so that they can be able to influence and have their voices heard, and their aspirations captured. We are planning to do this actually with the support of this project, and it's one of the things we see, because we need to support that sector of the economy, because they actually contribute heavily to the economy. And if they are not supported, they may be kicked out of business, which actually entrenches the aspect of inequality, the injustice, and the poverty further. So I just wanted to speak to that in terms of the influencing the reform of the enabling environment, especially on taxes, but also the current Market Act and regulations for Uganda, which actually relates a lot with the informal sector. Yeah.
All right. Thank you. So if I got your question very correctly, you're saying the government looks at the capacity and not the composition of the informal sector. They should look at the composition and not the capacity. Okay, they currently look at the composition and not the capacity of the informal sector. And the major players on the informal sector being the women. Then your question, to be specific, I just paraphrased it. What has the government done to support women in the informal sector? Isn't it? Yes. So from a Zambian perspective, I'll look at it from 2021 coming onwards. See, the government came up with an initiative to increase the Constituency Development Fund. The Constituency Development Fund used to be 26 million kwacha. Then it was increased to about 4 billion kwacha. And the beneficiaries of this Constituency Development Fund, specifically being women and the youths. So the government did a deliberate intervention, knowing for sure that most of the people who are in the formal sector are the women.
Given the time, I think we should wrap it up. But I'd just like to thank all of you for taking part in this session and thank the panelists. Again, the conversation does not have to end now. I'm sure there's tea outside, so please feel free to conversate and speak more about anything specific that we didn't get a chance to touch on. In the front here, we have the most recent copy of the Fair Tax Monitor for Uganda, as well as the Fair Tax Monitor for Zambia. Please feel free to grab a copy. And also, I hope by the end of this session, we do have a better understanding of fiscal justice for women and girls.